In the heart of Manhattan, in a penthouse worth $30 million, lived a boy who had everything money could buy: designer clothes, private tutors, a room bigger than most apartments. But Marcus Sterling had never heard his father say, "I love you." Not because his father didn't love him, but because Marcus couldn't hear him say it. This is the story of how a humble maid discovered the truth that a billionaire had been too blind to see. A truth that would shatter a wall of silence 8 years in the making. It was a Saturday morning when our story begins. 8-year-old Marcus sat alone at one end of a dining table that could seat 20 people. His father, Richard Sterling, sat at the other end, eyes glued to his tablet, making million-dollar decisions before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating, but it was a silence they'd both grown accustomed to. Marcus reached for the orange juice pitcher. His small hands struggled with the weight. The pitcher slipped. Glass shattered against the marble floor. Orange juice spread across the pristine white tablecloth like a sunset bleeding into snow. Richard Sterling didn't even look up. Not because he was cruel, not because he didn't care, but because he'd learned years ago that his son wouldn't respond anyway. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Marcus had called out. He'd screamed, "Dad," at the top of his lungs, but in a way his father couldn't understand. In the silence that followed, Marcus felt something break inside him that wasn't made of glass. He stared at his father's back as Richard walked away, phone pressed to his ear, already on to the next deal, the next meeting, the next everything that wasn't his son. Marcus was 8 years old, and he'd never felt more invisible in his entire life. That same morning, Elena Rodriguez arrived for her first day as the Sterling family's new housemaid. She stood outside the towering building, staring up at its glass and steel facade, clutching her bag so tightly her knuckles were white. She was nervous. This job paid 3 times what she'd made anywhere else. It could change her life, help her send money back to her family in Ecuador, maybe even bring her mother to the States for the surgery she desperately needed. But the agency had warned her. The Sterling household went through staff quickly. No one ever explained why. James, the head butler, met her at the service entrance. He was 60 years old, impeccably dressed, and his face showed absolutely no emotion whatsoever. He gave her the tour with the enthusiasm of a man reading an instruction manual. His instructions were clear and cold. "Master Richard values 3 things, Miss Rodriguez: punctuality, discretion, and invisibility. You're here to maintain the residence, not to be seen or heard, especially by Master Richard himself. Do you understand?" Elena nodded. "Yes, sir. And what about Marcus, the boy?" James's expression flickered for just a moment. Something that might have been pity, or perhaps regret. "The boy is complicated. He doesn't speak, doesn't respond. Some say he's disturbed. Others say he's just spoiled rotten. The last 3 maids couldn't handle him. Couldn't handle the silence. My advice? Keep your distance. Do your job. Don't get attached." But Elena Rodriguez had never been good at following rules that felt wrong. That afternoon, Elena entered Marcus's bedroom to clean. The moment she stepped inside, she stopped dead in her tracks. The room was perfect, too perfect. It looked like a display in a luxury furniture store, not a child's bedroom. The bed was made with military precision. Not a single toy lay scattered on the floor. No crayon marks decorated the walls. No posters of superheroes or athletes. No life. It was the saddest room Elena had ever seen. But there, on a shelf near the window, were dozens of notebooks, stacked neatly, organized by color. Elena's curiosity got the better of her. She pulled one down and opened it. Page after page of drawings. Beautiful, detailed sketches that showed real talent. Pictures of people talking, laughing, arguing, singing, embracing. Families at dinner tables. Children playing in parks. Teachers in classrooms. Every single picture had speech bubbles floating above the characters' heads. And every single speech bubble was completely empty. Elena's heart began to break, right there in that too-perfect room. These weren't the drawings of a disturbed child or a spoiled brat. These were the drawings of a boy desperately trying to understand a world he couldn't fully access. A boy documenting conversations he could never join. That's when she heard a small sound behind her. A sharp intake of breath. Elena turned. Marcus stood in the doorway, frozen like a deer in headlights. His eyes were wide, filled with fear and shame. He'd been caught. The maids always left after they saw his drawings. They thought he was strange, broken, wrong. He waited for Elena to put the notebook down in disgust and walk out, just like the others had done. But Elena didn't leave. Instead, she did something that changed everything. She lifted her hands and signed, "Hello, I'm Elena. Your drawings are beautiful." Marcus's world stopped spinning. His jaw literally dropped open. His eyes filled with tears. For the first time in 4 long, lonely years, someone was speaking HI's language. His hands trembled as he signed back, You can understand me?" Elena smiled, and it was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Yes, sweetheart, I can understand you. My little brother was deaf. I've been signing since I was 7 years old." Marcus collapsed to his knees and began to cry. Not silent tears, but full body-shaking sobs. All the loneliness, all the frustration, all the years of being invisible came pouring out of him. Elena rushed over and wrapped him in her arms. "It's okay. It's okay. I'm here now. I see you, Marcus. I see you." Over the next few days, Elena learned Marcus's story. Not through words, but through signs, through drawings, through the broken pieces of a childhood that should have been filled with joy. Marcus had been born perfectly healthy. A beautiful baby boy with his father's eyes and his late mother's smile. Yes, his mother. Sarah Sterling had died when Marcus was only 2 years old. A car accident. Sudden, brutal, senseless. Richard Sterling had thrown himself into work to cope with the grief. And little by little he'd stopped noticing his son. When Marcus was 3, he stopped responding to his name, stopped answering questions, stopped speaking altogether. Richard assumed it was trauma from losing his mother. The doctors said it was selective mutism, a psychological condition where children choose not to speak due to anxiety or trauma. But when Marcus was 4, Richard took him to a specialist for a hearing test. The audiologist put headphones on Marcus and played various sounds, beeps, tones, music. Marcus responded to some of them. Not all, but enough. "Mr. Sterling," the doctor had said, "your son's auditory processing is functional. He can hear. This appears to be behavioral, not medical. Richard had been furious, not at the doctor, but at Marcus. He'd spent thousands of dollars, taken time off work, rearranged his entire schedule. And for what? To be told his son was just being difficult? "Why won't you just talk to me?" Richard had shouted, his grief and frustration boiling over. "Do you know how much this is costing? How much time you're wasting?" Little Marcus had reached out to his father, trying to explain, trying to show him something was wrong. But Richard had pulled away, disappointed and hurt. After that, Richard stopped trying, and Marcus stopped hoping. What neither of them knew was that the doctor had been wrong, dead wrong. Elena discovered the truth quite by accident. She was reading to Marcus one evening signing as she went when she noticed something odd. When she spoke out loud, Marcus showed no reaction. But when a door slammed downstairs, he jumped. When a car horn blared outside, he turned his head. He could hear sounds, but he couldn't hear speech. That night, Elena stayed up until 3 a.m, researching on her phone. And there it was, Auditory Processing Disorder. A condition where the ears work perfectly fine, but the brain can't properly decode speech patterns. To someone with a PD, conversation sounds like random noise, static, gibberish. Marcus could hear a door slam, a car horn, music, but when people spoke, it was just meaningless sound. That's why he'd responded to some of the tones in the hearing test, but seemed to ignore speech. That's why every doctor had said his ears were fine. Because his ears were fine. It was the connection between his ears and his brain that was broken. And Richard Sterling, in his grief and frustration, had stopped looking for answers. He'd decided his son was choosing silence, choosing to reject him. Elena knew she had to tell Richard the truth. But she also knew that men like Richard Sterling didn't like being told they were wrong, especially not by their maid. She needed to be smart about this. The next day was Sunday. Elena convinced James to let her take Marcus to the park. It took some persuading, but James finally agreed, perhaps sensing that this woman was different from the other maids who'd come and gone. At the park, Marcus was transformed. He ran through the grass, laughing silently, pointing at everything: dogs, pigeons, other children playing. Elena signed with him constantly, and for the first time in his life, Marcus felt like a normal kid. They were sitting by the fountain, eating ice cream, when Marcus suddenly grabbed Elena's hand. His signs were frantic, desperate. "Slow down, sweetheart," Elena signed back. "What's wrong?" Marcus's hand shook as he signed. "He doesn't know. My father. He thinks I choose not to talk. He thinks I don't love him, but I do. I love him so much. I just can't. I can't make him understand." Tears streamed down Marcus's face. "I tried. When I was little, I tried so hard. But he got angry. He thought I was being bad. Now he won't even look at me. He's given up on me." Elena pulled Marcus into a fierce hug. In that moment, she made a decision that could cost her everything. Her job, her work visa, her dreams. But some things were more important than safety. That evening, Elena found Richard in his study. He was on a video call with Tokyo, discussing quarterly projections and market shares. She waited outside the door for 20 minutes until the call ended. When she knocked, Richard's voice came through, irritated. "What is it?" Elena entered. Richard didn't even look up from his laptop. "Mr. Sterling, I need to speak with you about Marcus." Richard sighed deeply, the sound of a man who'd had this conversation too many times before. "James warned me you'd become attached. Look, Miss Rodriguez, my son's condition has been evaluated by the best specialists in the country. I appreciate your concern, but he's not deaf to sound," Elena interrupted. "He's deaf to language." The typing stopped. For the first time, Richard looked up. Elena took a deep breath. This was it. No turning back now. "It's called Auditory Processing Disorder, Mr. Sterling. Marcus can hear noises, doors closing, cars honking, music playing, but his brain can't decode speech patterns. When you talk to him, all he hears is noise. Random, meaningless noise. That's why the hearing tests came back normal. His ears work fine. But the connection between his ears and the language centers of his brain, it's not working the way it should." Richard stared at her. That's not possible. Someone would have diagnosed it. I took him to 5 different specialists. Not if you stopped taking him after you got an answer you didn't like. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Richard's face flushed with anger. "How dare you come into my home and— When was the last time you looked at your son, Mr. Sterling?" Elena's voice was quiet, but firm. "Really looked at him? Not through disappointment or frustration, but really saw him?" Silence. Heavy, terrible silence. Elena reached into her apron pocket and pulled out one of Marcus's notebooks. She placed it on Richard's desk. "He drew this last week." Richard opened it with shaking hands. The drawing showed their penthouse at night. Every detail was perfect. The furniture, the windows, the city lights beyond. In the corner sat Richard at his desk, surrounded by laptops and phones and documents. And in the opposite corner, so small he was almost missed, was Marcus. He was reaching out, mouth open in a silent scream. The speech bubble above his head read, "Daddy, I'm here. Please see me. I'm right here." Richard Sterling, a man who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, who'd stared down corporate sharks and hostile takeovers, began to cry. His hands trembled as he turned the pages, drawing after drawing of the same scene. Marcus reaching out. Richard turning away. Over and over and over again. "Oh God," Richard whispered. "What have I done?" That night, Richard Sterling did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He stood outside his son's bedroom door, notebook in hand, and tried to find the courage to go inside. His hand rose to knock, then fell, rose again, fell again. What could he possibly say? How could he apologize for 8 years of neglect, for making his son feel invisible, for giving up on him? Finally, Richard turned the doorknob and entered. Marcus was asleep, a small night light casting shadows across his face. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in years, he really looked at his son. He saw things he'd never noticed before. The way Marcus slept with one ear pressed firmly into the pillow, trying to block out the confusing noise of the world. The small hearing aid on the knitstand. When had Marcus gotten it? Who had taken him? The books on sign language hidden under the bed, their spines cracked from constant use. How had he missed all of this? Richard began to cry, silently at first, trying not to wake his son. Then he realized the bitter irony. He could sob as loudly as he wanted, and Marcus would never hear him. "I'm so sorry," Richard whispered into the darkness. "I'm so sorry. I failed you. I failed your mother. I failed everything that matters. Marcus's eyes opened. Father and son stared at each other across a gulf of misunderstanding and hurt. Slowly, carefully, Marcus sat up. He was cautious, like an animal that's been kicked too many times. Richard did something he hadn't done in 4 long years. He opened his arms. For a moment, Marcus didn't move. Could this be real? Or was it another dream that would shatter with the morning light? Then Marcus crashed into his father's embrace, sobbing silently against his chest. Richard held him like the world was ending, and his son was the only solid thing left in existence. They stayed like that for an hour, not speaking, not signing, just holding on. The next morning, Richard Sterling did something unprecedented. He canceled his Monday meetings, all of them. The Tokyo deal, the board presentation, the merger talks with the German company. "Sir," his assistant stammered over the phone, "this will cost the company millions. Are you certain?" "I've already lost something worth more than money," Richard replied. "I'm not losing another day." Richard spent that entire day with Elena, learning the basics of sign language. His first attempts were clumsy, awkward. He mixed up letters, forgot words, got frustrated with himself. But when he signed "Good morning" to Marcus at breakfast, and Marcus's entire face lit up with joy, Richard knew he'd never work harder at anything in his entire life. The following week, Richard took Marcus to a new specialist. Dr. Sarah Chun was one of the country's leading experts on auditory processing disorder. She spent 3 hours testing Marcus using techniques that previous doctors had never tried. Finally, Dr. Chun sat down with Richard in her office. "Mr. Sterling, your son has severe auditory processing disorder. His peripheral hearing is perfect. His ears work beautifully. But the neural pathways that process speech are significantly impaired. To Marcus, when you speak, it sounds like a radio stuck between stations. Just static and noise." Richard's voice was hollow. "Can it be treated?" "Yes and no. We can't fix the neural pathways, but we can teach Marcus coping strategies. Special hearing aids that enhance speech patterns. Therapy to help him read lips. And most importantly, Mr. Sterling, learning sign language, which I understand you've already started." "How?" Richard's voice cracked. "How did I miss this for 8 years?" Dr. Chun's expression softened. "Because a PD is tricky. It mimics other conditions. And because the initial hearing tests came back normal, everyone assumed it was behavioral. You're not the first parent to miss this, Mr. Sterling, and you won't be the last. What matters is what you do now." Richard looked through the window into the waiting room, where Elena and Marcus were signing back and forth, both laughing at something. "I do everything," Richard said firmly. "Whatever it takes." The transformation didn't happen overnight. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. Richard hired a sign language tutor who came to the penthouse every evening. He attended therapy sessions with Marcus, learning how to communicate, not just with signs, but with patience and understanding. He learned that Marcus loved astronomy, but had been too afraid to tell anyone. So Richard bought a telescope, and they spent nights on the penthouse terrace, Richard signing the names of constellations while Marcus pointed excitedly at the stars. He learned that Marcus had been teaching himself to draw because it was the only way he could express himself. So Richard enrolled them both in an art class where they sat side by side, painting terrible pictures and laughing at their mutual lack of talent. He learned that Marcus had felt responsible for his mother's death, believing that if he'd been a better son, she wouldn't have been driving that day. So Richard held his son and signed over and over, "It wasn't your fault. It was never your fault. And she loved you more than anything in the world." Slowly the walls came down. The silence that had divided them for 8 years began to fill with laughter, with understanding, with love. 3 months later, the Sterling penthouse was barely recognizable. Marcus's drawings hung framed on the walls, no longer hidden in notebooks, but displayed with pride. The speech bubbles were still empty, but now they felt like art rather than tragedy. The massive dining table had been replaced with a smaller, round one that forced everyone to sit close together. Color had invaded the once sterile space. Photos everywhere. Life everywhere. One evening, they sat down for dinner, Richard, Marcus, and Elena, who had become more family than employee. They signed as they ate, telling stories about their day. James entered with a tablet. "Sir, the board is ready for your video presentation on the European expansion." Richard glanced at the tablet, then at Marcus, who was in the middle of signing an animated story about something funny that had happened at school. Richard signed to Marcus. "Hold that thought." Then to James. "Tell them I'm busy. Reschedule for tomorrow morning." James's composure cracked for just a second, his eyes widening. In 15 years of service, he'd never known Richard Sterling to postpone a board meeting. "Sir, are you certain?" Richard turned back to Marcus and signed, "I missed 8 years. I'm not missing another minute." Marcus's hands flew. "Best dad in the whole world." Richard's eyes filled with tears, something that happened a lot more easily these days. He signed back, "I'm still learning. I'm still learning. I make mistakes every day." Marcus signed, "That's okay. Me too. We'll learn together." 6 months after Elena Rodriguez walked into the Sterling household, everything had changed. Richard had restructured his entire company, promoting trusted executives and delegating responsibilities. He now worked from home 3 days a week, and when he was in the office, he left by 5 o'clock. Every single day. The business magazines called it a scandal. "Tech billionaire loses his edge," one headline read. Wall Street analysts worried about his commitment. Richard Sterling didn't care. Marcus had started at a new school, one that specialized in children with learning differences. For the first time in his life, he had friends. Real friends who signed with him, who understood him, who saw him as Marcus, not as the weird kid who wouldn't talk. Elena had been promoted from maid to Marcus's full-time aide and interpreter. Richard tripled her salary and brought her mother to the United States for her surgery. When Elena cried and tried to thank him, Richard signed, "You gave me back my son. I can never repay that debt." On a Saturday morning, exactly 6 months after Elena's first day, Richard and Marcus sat at their small round table, eating breakfast together. Richard was still clumsy with his signs, still had to pause to remember words, but he never stopped trying. Marcus signed, "Dad, can we go to the park today?" "Feed the ducks?" Richard smiled and signed back, "Yes, anything you want." Marcus hesitated, then signed something he'd been too afraid to sign before. "Can we bring flowers for Mom? Tell her about everything?" Richard's throat tightened. They hadn't visited Sarah's grave together in 6 years. Richard had been too consumed with work, and Marcus had been too afraid his father would say no. "I would love that," Richard signed. "She would be so proud of you. So proud of both of us." As they got ready to leave, Marcus ran back to his room and returned with something in his hands, a new drawing. He'd been working on it in secret for weeks. It showed the three of them, Richard, Marcus, and Sarah, at their small round table. This time every speech bubble was full of I love you and pass the butter and how was your day and all the beautiful, mundane, precious conversations that make a family. Richard stared at the drawing, unable to speak, unable to sign. Finally he knelt down so he was eye level with his son. He signed, slow and careful, making sure every word was clear. For 8 years I couldn't hear you. Not because you weren't speaking, but because I wasn't listening. I thought love was providing for you, protecting you, giving you everything money could buy. But the only thing you ever wanted was me, and I was too blind to see it. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Marcus signed back. You already have, Dad. You came back. That's all I ever wanted. For you to come back. They embraced, and in that moment the silence that had once divided them became the peace that united them. In a world of infinite noise, sometimes the most important things are said without sound. Marcus Sterling never did learn to speak with his voice, but he learned to speak with his hands, his art, his heart. And Richard Sterling, the billionaire who had everything, learned that the greatest treasure had been right in front of him all along. He just needed someone to help him see. Sometimes we're all a little deaf, not to sound, but to the people we love. We hear, but we don't listen. We look, but we don't see. We're present, but we're not truly there. Marcus and Richard Sterling found each other again, not through miracles or magic, but through patience, forgiveness, and a humble maid who refused to accept that silence meant the end of conversation. Because love doesn't need sound. It just needs presence, attention, and the willingness to learn a new language no matter how long it takes. This was the story of the silent heir who found his voice, and the father who finally learned to listen.